when you come to a city afresh with a new pair of eyes, it's not somewhere I've been before, you take things in a way on face value. You see what you see and it impacts on you. And whilst at the same time you could do lots of research into the history and understand and build things up from the ground, on the other hand, I think it's quite interesting just to be stimulated by the physical built environment. And most of what I have seen is sort of the outsides of buildings. So then it becomes ironic that we're designing the interior of the building. But there were certain details. It's the use of the brass and the gilded metalwork. I forget which church it is, the cathedral here, which has the brass detail on the plinths of the columns, which is something that we used in here. So what you end up with, I think, is a distillation of a Western interpretation of St. Petersburg when one sees it. Because again, I know that there are comments that what we've done in the interior seems quite English. To me, it doesn't seem that English, and it's less English or British than we would do in Britain. So it's quite interesting that there is something inherently in my approach which is culturally grounded in where I come from. But from where I see it, it is actually filtered and moderated by my experience of St. Petersburg. And then there were practical things as well in terms of earlier schemes that we did, which is less to do with the architecture and the historic environment, is more to do with basically the latitude and how dark it is a lot of the year and how cold it is. And then we had done schemes which were quite dark and quite dramatic, and everyone's saying, no, you can't do this because we don't have that much daylight. It needs to be bright. It needs to be sort of fresh. So we had to respond on a sort of practical level to things like that. But basically, St. Petersburg is, an incredibly, obvious to say, very handsome, very beautiful, very extraordinary city. So I think these principles of proportion, handsomeness, sort of elegance, I think then inform the interior, in which case it's quite, again, compared to some of the earlier schemes we did, where we've ended up, I think it is essentially quite classic and classical, and therefore appropriate, I think, to the city and to the building. The style, well, we named this style because when we did the concept designs for Artview House, we did about 5 different presentations, 5 very, very different schemes. And we had one called Manhattan Modern, which was quite sort of Art Deco. We'd had another one which was very clubhouse, which was sort of very clubby, gentleman's club, but quite sort of modern. The one that we then developed and that the client preferred, we called Regency Light, which was, this is quite hard to explain, it is almost like a traditional Regency style or language of architecture, which then goes through the filter. There's a sort of movement which is called Hollywood Regency, which was something which happened in the 20s and 30s in Los Angeles and was, as the name suggests, born out of the movies, where they took Regency glamour, but they put a bit of American sort of Art Deco pizzazz into it. So we've almost taken that, which is, if you like, a sort of simplified but slightly deco version of Regency, and brought it through a British filter and St. Petersburg into what we've proposed here. So there are elements of Regency, of Art Deco, of traditional English architecture with this sort of sensibility towards St. Petersburg, which collectively come together in what we've proposed. Current tendencies, the one thing that I seem to be seeing, or has been happening, I think, for the last, I'd say 10 years even, is that there's been quite a strong movement away from overt modernism and minimalism. And I think there's a much stronger tendency, in the way that I just described, to revisit historic styles, or not even historic styles, to revisit traditional elements and notions of style and design, cherry pick, mix and match, become eclectic, and juxtapose historic pieces with very contemporary pieces and create something richer. But I think there's a sort of, and I suppose I'm speaking personally, that my own sensibility has moved very much away from a sort of minimalist or a hard aesthetic, because I think quite often it feels quite impoverished. It's not very nourishing. And I think when you're in a space, you need lots of things for your eye to rest on, to create interest, to stimulate you, and so on and so forth. I think if you work from the large scale to the small scale, I think what makes an exquisite interior is something which really understands and works from the big picture to the sort of the small details. So if you begin with the big picture, the first thing is space. Space is the ultimate luxury that people enjoy. And I think here we have a very, very generous lobby. And then you go from space to then how is that space manifest? What defines it? And so there you go to the question of material. So here we use unusual and luxurious materials to line and define the space. So whether it's marble on the floor, it's silk on the walls, it's gilding in the details of the columns, of the doors, etc., etc. And then from that level, you then move down to the details. So how do you interface with the space? And it's anything you touch. So really then, if you take the notion of the word exquisite, what is the experience when you take the door handle to open the door? Does it feel like a cheap piece of aluminium? Or in this case, is it a beautiful piece of sort of lead crystal glass, held in brass clamps? And that's the thing that you notice because your eye is focused, and then you move through the space and then it expands and you see the detail. And the lighting, I think, is probably the last thing that then brings all of those together, how you create ambience and atmosphere, but then you basically give accents and draw your eye and attention to the particular details that you've done. I think zones is slightly misleading. We have to understand, if you like, the function of this space. It's a lobby. It's how the building it presents itself to the residents and to visitors of those residents. So it's creating an impression. And in creating that impression, rather than actual functional zones, because I think there's a big question as to how, is somebody really going to sit by the fireside and curl up and read a book? No. Are they going to sit at that desk and are they going to work? No. But what will happen is people will wait for somebody coming down in the elevator or a car's coming to pick them up, so they will sit and wait. So they will pause in the space. So the zones, as they're described, I would prefer to call it, it's like creating a mise en scène. So you propose a possibility. So you create a space in front of the fireplace, which in your mind says that is inviting. And I might sit down there and wait for my friend by the fire. The desk, all it does is it engages your imagination. You think, I could sit down there, look out on the garden, write a letter, do some work. And that is sort of nourishing, that is engaging. But as I say, I don't think you're ever likely to do it. Then we have another space where there's more sort of social seating, where a few people might sit and pause and again wait for other people, whatever they're doing. But again, it's presenting an invitation where you might sit, where you might pause. So again, not functional zones, but the mise en scène, the invitations, the possibilities is how I'd see it. If you did something which was absolutely the zeitgeist, on the money in that moment, it can go either, because if you do it really well, that will become a classic interior because it will be the best moment, and the best example of that moment in time. So if you wind the clock back, if you took one of the most perfect Art Deco interiors, for example, that had happened, that should stay there forever because it's a piece of history. But then if you take somebody, at the same time, somebody did a very mediocre Art Deco interior, it shouldn't last because that was just following the trend that was prevalent. It was kind of fine, but actually that will date because it's the wannabe version. So really, it's about quality. So if you do a really great interior, it should transcend and become something that's a historical marker and should sort of be preserved or should survive by virtue of its quality. If it's a mediocre thing, then that's last season, 10 years on, you do the next thing. I think residential interiors like this are a very different proposition. If you work on hotels, hotels are operating in a sort of commercial marketplace, and you would always expect to redesign the interior of a hotel, say, every 10 years. And I'm working on 2 projects in Ireland, one in Belfast, one in Dublin. The hotel in Dublin I first designed 20 years ago. We redid it 10 years ago. And we're now gutting and completely redoing the hotel again, which is an odd one because you're undoing your own work, but they can't compete in the marketplace with an interior that is 10 years old because new hotels come along and then there you have to follow the trends and do something new. Residential interiors, I would like to think that this interior, because it is very, I think, integral to the building and responds to the building, and is essentially quite conservative but high quality, I think should have a very long lifespan. You know, I think furniture will wear, tear, change, but I think essentially it will last for a long time. I think we've created something which is very inviting, warm, comforting, elegant, sophisticated, though I say so myself. And then texture, I think, is the second part of that, and I think you can never underestimate how important texture is. So again, the wall covering, having the silk on the walls, you don't just see a flat, dead colour. So if you look at the walls in here, I mean, it's a very beautiful paint. I know what sort of paint this is, but it's very chalky and absorbs the light. But what you see is what you get. You're not drawn to it. You don't want to touch it. There's no extra layer of richness. And then sort of just texture in the finishes. You know, the columns here, scalloping, shaping, beautiful plaster work, which again, you know, you want to touch and feel just how smooth that is. In England, is to have white doors, have that sort of cleanness and freshness, which is definitely something we wanted to do here. And again, in the spirit of keeping the interior space quite light and quite fresh. The lifts, basically, we have sort of condensed the principles of the design that we have through the lobby into the lift car. So we have the sort of the lacquered brass, we have the panelling, and we have the decorative motif that we have again in the door screens. So it's a very sort of compressed space, but the thing that you tend to do in a lift is you're just sort of standing there, sort of looking around, so you can never underestimate how important it is. And then we've tried to introduce lighting in there, which is quite special. So we have a concealed cove light, which gives reflected light. Then we have this sunburst brass feature pendant lamp, which sits in the centre of the lift. So it becomes this sort of decorative focus in things. So it's a perfect sort of capsule, really, of the design motifs that we have throughout. The response is very cognizant that this is a very prestigious building, that this is for informed purchasers who probably own other properties, who have international portfolios of properties. So what we're doing, I think, is very high quality, is sort of luxurious in a relatively restrained way. So we haven't sort of gone, you know, too far. And I think presents the building as a sort of high class, high caliber, premium development, which is the whole objective.